Hello, God's people. Okay, so today we're on Bible study. We're talking about our God is a God of perfect timing, and we're going to use the book of Esther to kind of bring this out. But this is displayed throughout the entire Bible, and I know you hear sometimes even a song say He might not come when you want Him, but He's always on time. This is going to be a perfect example of that. Just to encourage you and to know that God has everything planned out according to his timing and that he has time all in his hand. So we're going to look at that today in the Bible study. Along the way, I'm going to drop some nuggets, but it's going to be up to you to pick them up. So our God is a God of perfect timing. This can encourage you in a lot of different ways, whether you're waiting on something from God or you find yourself in a situation that you're struggling with, or just knowing and starting to perceive how our God works things out, even when you don't understand it and see how it's working together for your good. But he's already done it, and he's already put you in that place, and he's already worked that thing out for you before you even knew it. Our God he's a miracle worker. He is a God of perfect timing. So let's go ahead and talk about that in this Bible lesson, and let's go ahead and get started. So to understand this, you're gonna have to know, read the entire book of Esther. But for time's sake, I'm not, we're not gonna read it verbatim. I'm just gonna give some overviews of the chapters and point out and highlight certain scriptures so that you can understand this entire story. If you haven't read it, go back and read it, um, so that you can understand exactly how God worked all this stuff out in perfect time. So let's go ahead and start. So in Esther chapter 1, you have the king, and he has this great feast, and it's a feast for everybody. And the king has invited all type of people to his feast, and he calls his wife, the queen, and he wanted because she was beautiful. He actually just wanted to kind of show off to all the princes and everybody that came how beautiful his wife and everything was. But she was having her own separate gathering and party with some, princesses and other women. And when he called her, she refused to come. And it embarrassed the king. And the people, his princes, he asked his advisors, what shall I do? And they said, well, you got to do something, because if you don't do something, then all of the other women in the land are not going to honor their husbands, because you're the king and you called your queen and she refused to come. So he asked his counselors, what should he do? And they advised him to say, hey, give her place to somebody else. So, and remove her from being queen. So that's exactly what he did. And he removed her from being queen, and he sought out um, another queen. So they went in the land and did a selection and brought all of the fairest virgins together to basically try out and see who would become the next queen. In this process, Esther gets called. Esther has a uncle named Mordecai, and he was taking care of Esther as his own daughter. And he says to Esther, Esther, you go ahead and you go also and see if you will be selected. And it just so happened that Esther ends up finding favor above all of the other women that were called, all of the other um, fair young virgins that was called. And Esther ended up being selected. And the king actually loved Esther above everybody else. So here is Esther gets called, she gets selected, she becomes queen. The king marries her and she becomes queen. Fast forward a little bit, so you'll read all this if you haven't read it or already know the story. Mordecai hears a plot. All of this is going to fall into place. It's going to show exactly how God put everything in perfect timing and everything in its piece. You're gonna see this. So Mordecai overhears a plot to kill the king from these two men, and he tells Esther. And Esther reveals the situation, but she doesn't reveal it in her name. She reveals it in the name of her uncle Mordecai. And it comes to find out that actually these men were trying to kill the king. So they end up, being hanged after their plot was unfolded. And they recorded this in the Chronicles of the Kings, that Mordecai had revealed this and saved the king's life. All of this is going to come into play later on in the story. And I think that's where we are with chapter 2. Now let's go ahead and let's skip over to chapter 3. Okay, so let's go ahead and pick up in chapter 3. So in chapter 3, there's this man named Haman. And Haman is promoted in the king's uh, uh, kingdom, to maybe like second in command or something. Haman finds favor with the king and he gets promoted. And when he gets promoted, he comes riding out of the king's gate with on a horse, and everybody's bowing to him and giving him reverence. Mordecai, Esther's uncle, he doesn't give Haman any reverence. He doesn't bow to Haman. He doesn't bow to Haman. I just want y'all to start taking notes of certain things. But anyway, and he hangs out at the king's gate. So when Haman comes past and he sees Mordecai and everybody else bowed and reverenced him, but Mordecai didn't, Haman got very upset and he was mad that Mordecai had the audacity not to bow before him and give him his reverence. So Haman goes back to the king, knowing that Mordecai was a Jew, and saying, there's this people, and he basically tossed to the king to say, hey, this is people in the land that don't profit, they're no good. Give me permission to destroy all of them, and I'm going to give a reward for every one that I destroy. And the king didn't think nothing of it. He said, okay, go ahead. Oh, let me also note that Esther is a Jew, but Mordecai commanded Esther in chapter 1 and 2. I forgot to tell you this, not to tell anyone that she was a Jew. So the king didn't know that she was a Jew. So anyhow, Haman gets upset, and he gets this letter from the king and his declaration to be able to destroy all of the Jews. And he has a set time that he has to be able to go out and destroy all of the Jews in the land. Mordecai finds out about this, and Mordecai starts to grieve. He starts to fast. He goes in sackcloth and ashes. He starts to fast about this situation. And all of the Jews in the land start crying out about the situation too, and start fasting, because here is a commandment against them from the king that uh, they should all be destroyed. There's a lot of lessons here, y'all, but I'm just gonna focus on the one. I'm gonna focus on the one that the topic that we're on. So Mordecai, Esther hears about this, and she tells her maidens to go comfort her uncle and send him some clothes, because she hears about her uncle crying and fasting and mourning at the king's gate. But Mordecai refuses to put on any new clothes or anything, or to stop mourning, and he go ahead and lets Esther know what's going on. So he tells the maidens that come to him, hey, go tell Esther that this is what's going on, that Haman has a letter to kill all of the Jews, and that's why everybody's crying, and that's why everybody's fasting, and that's where we at. So I want to point out something in chapter 4. So let's go to that one. Okay, so I hope I'm explaining it and you're able to follow with what's going on so far. So Mordecai tells Esther that she needs to um, go before the king. And Esther says to him, it's not my time to go before the king. If I go before the king before my time, when I'm not called, if he doesn't hold out his scepter, then I get killed. This is a whole nother thing. So Jump over to verse 13 and 14. So I want to read this to you. So Mordecai answers her this. Then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther and says, think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. So he tells her, don't think that you're going to escape more than anybody else, just because you're in the king's house. Verse 14, and he says, for if thou altogether hold your peace at this time, then shall an enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knows whether you are come to the kingdom for such a time as this? So Mordecai tells her, if you hold your peace and you don't speak up for us at this time, and you don't go before the king, God is still going to send deliverance from somewhere. But who knows, Esther, if God didn't put you in this position for such a time as this? Couple things here I just want to note before we go forward. Esther was fearful that if she went before the king when she wasn't called, that her life was in jeopardy. She if he didn't give her favor when he called her, she would be put to death. Let me give you a nugget here. He who seeks to save his life shall lose it. But Jesus says, he who loses his life for my sake shall find it for life eternal. Just gonna throw that out there. When you keep reading in chapter 4, Esther goes back and gives her uncle this answer. And she says, go and gather all of the Jews together and fast with me for 3 days. And she says, I'm not going to fast either. She says, and I'm going to go before the king after my 3 days of fasting. And if I perish, she says, let me perish. Let's keep going because the story ain't over. Okay, we're at chapter 5. So Esther puts her life on the line. And Esther comes before the king's court. And she goes before the king on that day when she wasn't called. And the king saw her. And the king held out his scepter to her, giving her favor, and drew near. And when the king saw her, he asked his queen, he says, what's your request, queen? Why have you come? What do you want? I will give you whatever you want, up to half of my kingdom. That's all right. And Esther answers him and says, this is what I want. She didn't disclose exactly what she wanted just yet. But she says, she answers the king and says, let Haman come this day to a banquet that I have prepared for him. And she requests that Haman and the king come to a special banquet that she's prepared. And the only people that get to come in this banquet is Haman and the king. So the king says, okay. So he tells Haman, Haman, go prepare yourself. You're going to come to a banquet for me and the queen. This is what the queen wants. And Haman is glad. And Haman leaves out to go brag about this to his family. How the king has called him to a special banquet between him and the queen, and how he is, prospering and so favor and got so much favor with the king, um, and he's just happy. But on his way of leaving out, he sees Mordecai. Now I want you to take note of this. He sees Mordecai, and here is Haman has already wrote the letter against Mordecai and all the Jews to kill them. When he comes out on a horse, riding past the king's gate again, Mordecai's at the king's gate fasting and in ashes and in sackcloth. But when he sees Haman, Mordecai still don't bow to him. He still don't bow to him. And I want you to just take note of that. He still don't bow to Haman, even though Haman has his hand against Mordecai and seems to be in this position of power. Haman gets even more upset that Mordecai still don't bow to him. So when he goes to his family, he tells his family of all of this stuff going on, but he says none of this stuff matters as long as this man Mordecai is still alive, because he still ain't bowing to me. Haman's in his pride. He's like, it don't matter to me because this man still won't bow and give me my reverence. So his family says, hey, build up a gallows and hang him and kill him. And when you go to your feast with your banquet with the queen and the king, ask the king permission to hang Mordecai. You got so much favor with the king, he'll let you do it. And Mordecai was glad. He was like, yeah, that's a good idea. So he commands that this big gallows be built for him to hang Mordecai from. Now, let's get to the good part. See, this is where you start to see where God puts everything together in perfect timing. And that you need not to fear anything. You need not to fear your enemies. You need not to fear situation. You might not know what's going on, but our God has put everything together in this perfect place. And we're going to really address all this in the conclusion, but I need you to follow along with me so you can understand this. So we're at chapter 6 now, verse 1 through 3. And it just so happened on the night before the banquet request, when Esther put her life on the line and made the request for Haman and the king to come to the banquet, that on that night, let's read verse 1, that on that night the king could not sleep. And he commanded to bring the book of the records of the chronicles, and they were read before the king. So it just so happened that that night the king couldn't sleep. He was restless. And he just happened to ask that the book of the chronicles come and be read before him. You know, let me hit a bedtime story, I guess. I don't know. Verse 2. And it was found written that Mordecai had told of the two people that was going to try to kill the king, um, and who sought to lay hand on the king. In verse 3. And the king says, what honor or dignity has been done to Mordecai for this? And the king's servant says back to him that nothing has been done for Mordecai. So now remember, it just happened that Mordecai overheard the plot of the king. And he told Esther. And Esther just happens to be in this position at this time. And Esther records it in the chronicles of the king that Mordecai revealed this plot and saved the king's life. Now, here it is. Haman is preparing to kill Mordecai and destroy all of the Jews and to come before the king with this request. But the night of before, the king can't sleep. And he just happens to ask, are you following with me? He just happened to ask, hey, bring the book of the Chronicles and read it to me. And he just happens to get to the part where Mordecai saved his life. And he realizes and he asks, what was done for Mordecai? And they say, nothing was done for Mordecai that saved your life. I want you to start putting everything together. Because when we conclude, you'll see how God is perfectly positioned Esther, how God is perfectly positioned Mordecai, how God is perfectly, he's a God of perfect timing, a God of perfect timing. You might not understand how the situation is working out, but all you need to know is that it's working out for your good. That's why I can boldly say, all things are working together for my good. That's why the saints can boldly say, that's why you can boldly say, all things are working together for my good. All of those that love him and that are called according to his purposes, working together for your good, even when it don't seem like it is. And we're going to keep going. So, but I just want you to see how God just happened to disturb the king that night. And the king couldn't sleep. And the book was read just at that perfect time. Let's keep going because we got more to explore. Okay, I'm gonna kind of wrap it up. I don't want it to be too long and put everything together, just lay it out plainly. So in the rest of chapter 6, what happens is the next morning, Haman is coming in to have this request to kill Mordecai. And just as he is coming in, the king is asking where is one of his princes or somebody that can honor and give him advice on how to honor Mordecai. So Haman comes in just at this perfect time, and they say Haman's in the courtyard. So Haman comes in before the king, and the king requests him, and the king doesn't tell him who he wants to reward. But the king says to Haman, "Hey, Haman, who should we? How can you reward somebody that the king really want to greatly honor?" Because he was like, in his mind, he thinking, "How can I reward Mordecai for this?" But he doesn't say Mordecai's name. So Haman is sitting here thinking that the king is talking about rewarding him. So he gives this extravagant blessing that he can bless him with. King, if you want to reward somebody and honor them, you should let them ride on your horse and make all of the your highest princes honor him with new apparel, and let him ride and put the king's crown on his head and ride through the street and ride through the street and let everybody see and let a trumpet sound, let everybody know this is how the king honors somebody that the king wants to honor. And the king says, you know what, Haman, that's a good idea. And then he tells Haman, he says, Haman, go ahead and do that, and don't let nothing fail that you just said. Do all that stuff you just said, and go do it to Mordecai, the Jew that hangs out at my gate. Now here Mordecai leaves and has to go bless uh I mean, Haman leaves to have to go bless Mordecai. God will make your enemies your footstool. The very one that was building a gallows for you, God will turn around and have them hung on it. The very one that was cursing you, God will cause them to have to bless you. God says this to his own son: sit thou on my right hand until I make thy enemies thy footstool. I want to speak some fruit, some things into you. That's a nugget. But anyhow, um, Mordecai has to go. I mean, Haman has to go bless Mordecai. So he goes and he blesses Mordecai. And after he blesses Mordecai, he goes home and he starts to cry about what he had to do to bless Mordecai to his wife and his family. And his family basically says, hey, if that's what happened, then you're not going to prevail. So I'm going to just sum it all up. So you can go back and read the rest of the story just to give you something to go back and read. So Mordecai ends up, Haman ends up getting hung on the gallows that he prepared for Mordecai. Mordecai ends up taking Haman's position and being promoted in the land. God ends up blessing Mordecai and blessing the people. The writing that was against all the people end up getting reversed because Mordecai gets put in charge, and the people end up growing and prospering and being more blessed. That's the rest of the chapter. You can go back and read it because I know it'll be long. But my whole point is just saying this: when it comes to Esther and God of perfect timing, God put Esther in that position for such a time as this. God might have you in position that you don't understand for such a time as this. Esther decided to choose God and to put her life on the line for the work. God perfectly timed for Mordecai just to happen to overhear the plot on the king. He just happened to be in the right place at the right time to overhear that plot. It just happened that at the perfect timing, that when Haman was trying to destroy Mordecai, that the king couldn't sleep that night, and that the book of the Chronicles was read. It just happened to be at the perfect timing that Haman was coming to try to talk to the king to get permission to kill Mordecai. That at that same time, the king had already determined to bless Mordecai and made Haman to go do it. It just happened to be at the perfect timing that when Mordecai's enemy had built a gallows for him, it was set up for his own destruction. Our God put everything in its perfect place. Our God is a God of perfect timing. You might not understand how the situation is supposed to work out for you, and you might not even get why you might be in a place or situation. But I want you to see that God ordered every step, and God had all of the things timed out perfectly. Mordecai didn't know, Esther didn't know, but God did. Mordecai didn't know that God was going to disturb the king at the night. Esther didn't know that she was put in that position for such a time as this to deliver and to bless their people. But God had it all perfectly timed out. Even when your enemy is working against you, even God has perfectly timed that out. Even when a situation seems to be against you, trust the Lord. We're gonna look at one more thing, and before we go, and we're gonna just look at Joseph real fast, and then I'm gonna do a full conclusion. All right, so we at the ending of this, but I want you just to see because, and I'm really gonna bring home in the conclusion, but I want you to see this too, and I just want to point out this one particular situation. So in Genesis 41 and 14 through 16, you have where Joseph is now in the prison, and the Pharaoh happens to have a dream that can't nobody interpret, and the butler tells him about Joseph. And when you go to verse 14, the Pharaoh calls Joseph in and they bring him out the dungeon, change his clothes. In verse 15, the Pharaoh says to Joseph, I've dreamed a dream and there's none that can interpret. And I hear that you understand and can interpret dreams. And in verse 16, Joseph answers and says, it's not for me, but God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. And you read where Joseph ends up interpreting the dream. Why am I bringing this up? A couple things. I want you to take note to this. God will give, and we'll talk about this on another lesson. God will God will pose a problem to someone or a situation that only you have the answer for. Just want you to think about that. Same thing with Daniel. Think about it. But outside of that, we're gonna talk about that one on another because we're talking about a God of perfect time. So it just so happened that once again Pharaoh can't sleep, and Joseph is the one in position to be able to interpret this dream. Joseph later on finds out and interprets the dream that there is a famine coming in the land and that Pharaoh has to prepare himself in the in Egypt for the famine that is coming. Joseph was put in this position, in this place, perfectly timed to give Pharaoh the counsel for the famine that is going to come. I want you to see the bigger picture here. Joseph was sold into slavery, put in this position, and later on he realizes that God put him in this position not for himself, even like Esther, but for the people of God in the future to protect them from a famine. This is when I begin to the God of perfect timing. Joseph didn't know none of this stuff, the same way Mordecai and Esther didn't know none of this stuff. But they was in the middle of their situation. But God knew that he had already had that the famine was going to come. To deliver his people, Joseph was perfectly timed here. And God gave Pharaoh this dream and put Joseph in that situation. What am I trying to say with this situation when it comes to timing? That God had timed all of this out perfectly. When you look in your life and your situation, you might think it's just for you, but it might be bigger than you. And you might not know when he's coming, but just like God came through for Mordecai, he's always on time. He might not come when you want him, like Joseph in the dungeon, but he's a God of perfect timing. Joseph was brought out at the perfect timing to prepare the people for the famine to come, because our God is a God of perfect timing. He has all time in his hand. The timing in your life, the timing in my life, the timing in the world, the timing in society, the times in the changing of seasons. It's all before him. He's a God of perfect timing. He might not show up when you want him, but you can be guaranteed that he's going to be right on time. And not only that he's going to be right on time, but he has already had the timing planned out perfectly. To the disturbing of Pharaoh's dream, to the disturbing of the king's night where he couldn't sleep, to the timing even of your enemies, to the timing of when the famine should come to prepare you for it, no matter what it is. I want you to understand that our God is a God of perfect timing, and he has everything timed out perfectly. I'm not going to do a conclusion because I'm kind of doing it right now. Don't fear. Understand that God has worked it out and that he will bring you out and that his timing is perfect. And sometimes the situation, the place you've been placed is not for you, but you've been perfectly placed there at the right time, for the right hour, and for the right reason. Seek God for that purpose. But he will bring you out and he will deliver you and he will give you an assignment and your purpose at the perfect time. And he has already planned out the situation ahead of you. And he has already put things in his perfect place because he's a God of perfect time. Go back and read that story again on your own and consider this story of Joseph. And not just that, consider the Bible in its entirety when you start thinking about how God has delivered everything in his perfect time and season. Our God is a God of perfect timing. Even if he doesn't come when you want him, he's always on time. He has the world and time and seasons all in his hand. He's working all things together for your good. We'll leave it right there. So God bless you. Just understand that there's some other nuggets, but I want to build on it and I don't want to do too much. Right. We're going to keep adding. We're going to keep building. We're going to keep building. All right. God bless you. Let's go.